In 1972, Carlos Santana stepped into a room in Queens and saw a photograph of a man he'd never met, a guru whose image, he said, was humming. Weeks later, he cut his hair. Months later, he gave up his name, his marriage, and the world that had made him famous. He surrendered everything to Sri Chinmoy, a teacher whose disciples spoke of discipline, purity, and transcendence. But while Santana was folding his hands in devotion, former disciples were describing a hidden world of control, celibacy, coercion, and secrecy. This is the story of how a musician searching for God found a man who claimed to sit in that seat, and what it took for Santana to finally walk away. Musicians have always reached toward the unseen, from jazz visionaries seeking transcendence to rock icons placing their trust in gurus, ashrams, and spiritual masters. The search for meaning has pulled artists into worlds far beyond the stage. Some found peace, others found pressure, and many discovered that devotion can blur into something far more dangerous. These are the fault lines between music, faith, and control. This is Cult of the Needle. Carlos Santana did not arrive at Sri Chinmoy's door as a blank slate. By the time their paths crossed in the early 1970s, his life was already pulled between two powerful forces: roaring public success and a private, restless spiritual search. He had grown up surrounded by music and migration, moving from Mexico to the United States, playing in bars well before the world knew his name. By the late 1960s, his band had broken through in San Francisco's charged, chaotic scene. The Woodstock performance turned him into a symbol of an era. Long hair, eyes closed, guitar tone burning through humid air as 500,000 people watched. From the outside, it looked like the dream. Records sold, stages grew. The Santana name meant both a person and a sound. Yet success brought its own distortion. The machinery of touring, drugs, conflict, and expectations didn't answer deeper questions. It simply made them louder. The more external noise grew, the more internal quiet he craved. Around this time, Santana immersed himself in a different kind of listening. He tuned into the spiritual arc of John Coltrane, how a jazz musician had turned improvisation into a devotional act, how the later records seemed to reach for something beyond technique or style. Coltrane's search became a template, music as prayer, tone as testimony. Santana began fasting for days. He experimented not just with psychedelics, but with abstaining from them. He prayed, he read mystical texts. Eastern philosophies and Christian mysticism, New Age concepts, and esoteric books passed through his hands. He didn't simply cherry-pick ideas. He was looking for a coherent path, something that could organize the chaos in his life into a single, steady line pointing somewhere clear. Inside the band, change created tension. Some members wanted to lean harder into Latin rock and blues. Others favored jazz fusion and more experimental directions. Santana himself gravitated toward music that felt like it carried spiritual weight. The divergence in vision led to departures, reshuffling, and the familiar pattern of a band whose identity was tied to a founder still figuring out who he wanted to be. Interviews from that period show a man torn. On one side, there was the record label, the agents, the touring schedule, the pressure to repeat commercial success. On the other, there was a growing conviction that music should be used to transmit something higher than entertainment, an energy, a message, a light. The tools for that vision existed, but the framework did not. He had a sense of the destination with no map for the journey. This kind of unresolved hunger is especially powerful. It produces a sensitivity to signs, symbols, and people who seem to move with certainty. A photograph, a phrase, a presence can feel charged, not because of any intrinsic property, but because it lands in a space that has been waiting for it. By the time a photograph of Sri Chinmoy entered Santana's field of view, a decade of life had prepared him to see more in it than an image of a meditating man. He saw, or thought he saw, a state he could not reach alone. The idea that someone else had walked further into the territory he was only glimpsing was intoxicating. The tension between public acclaim and private doubt, between being a leader on stage and a seeker off stage, left him unusually open. He was not searching for a casual teacher or a weekend workshop. He was searching for someone who could occupy a central role in his inner life, someone he could trust to tell him what to do with his gifts, his impulses, his fears. When Larry Coryell and later John McLaughlin spoke of a guru in Queens, they weren't just passing on a spiritual recommendation. They were, knowingly or not, pointing a spiritually hungry man toward a system that promised discipline, clarity, and transcendence at the price of autonomy. Before Chinmoy ever spoke to him, Santana had already done the hardest part from a recruiter's perspective. He had convinced himself that he needed a guide. So who was Sri Chinmoy? Born Chinmoy Kumar Ghose on August 27, 1931, in the village of Shakpura, in what is now Bangladesh. Chinmoy's father, Shashi Kumar, was a government clerk, orderly, respected, the kind of man people brought their problems to. His mother, Yogamaya, was known more for her devotion than her position. Prayers at dawn, mantras under her breath as she cooked, a quiet belief that the divine was always listening. Chinmoy was the youngest of 7. He grew up in a house where gods and government forms sat side by side, rituals in the morning, paperwork in the afternoon, village life wrapped around both. As a boy, he was watchful rather than loud, drawn to hymns and stories of saints more than games in the street. Then, just as he entered adolescence, everything snapped. Within a short span, both of his parents died. The house emptied. The structure vanished. The children were suddenly unmoored in a country that had no safety net for orphans. Relatives arranged for the siblings to enter the Sri Aurobindo ashram in Pondicherry on India's southeast coast. The ashram was its own universe, a walled spiritual city devoted to the teachings of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother. It was a place where silence had rules, where bodies were trained, and where the interior life mattered more than anything happening outside the gates. This is where Chinmoy learned what a guru really was. Days at the ashram moved with strict rhythm, rising before dawn, collective meditations, work periods, physical training, long stretches of quiet. The guru's writings and talks were treated not as suggestions, but as a map of reality. Life there blurred family, religion, work, and identity into one thing: spiritual practice. Chinmoy threw himself into it. He joined the ashram's athletic program, running, lifting, pushing his body as if discipline itself were a kind of offering. He wrote constantly, poems, prayers, aphorisms about the soul and the supreme. He meditated for hours, often sitting alone in corners of the compound, eyes half closed, trying to hold his mind still. Inside the ashram, he was still one seeker among many. But slowly, he began to see himself differently. He believed he had touched something deep, states of consciousness he would later describe as realization, as if the divine were not just above him, but moving through him. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, the world outside was shifting. India was newly independent. Western travelers were arriving in ones and twos, then in waves. Students, artists, spiritual tourists looking for meaning they felt their own cultures had lost. Books on yoga and Eastern mysticism began to circulate in Europe and the United States. The hunger for authentic spiritual teachers was growing. Chinmoy's writings began to travel further than he did. Poems and essays were passed hand to hand, then mailed abroad. Somewhere in that circulation, they reached people connected to the United Nations in New York, staff who were already meditating, already searching, and who were struck by the intensity and simplicity of his language. An invitation followed. He was asked to come to New York to serve as a kind of spiritual resource for seekers there, especially among those working at or around the UN. It was a small opening on paper, a visa, a sponsor, the promise of modest work. But for Chinmoy, it was larger than that. It was a chance to step out of the role of disciple and into something else. Leaving the ashram was not a casual decision. It meant walking away from the structure that had raised him, from the teachers whose names and images had framed his entire adult life. But he framed the move as a mission, to bring a particular kind of inner discipline to a culture he was told was restless, fragmented, spiritually hungry. In April 1964, Chinmoy Kumar Ghose boarded a plane for the United States. He arrived in New York with a small suitcase, his writings, and very little money. The city he stepped into was loud, grimy, and electric, nothing like the ordered stillness of the ashram. But there was a thread of familiarity, too. The United Nations complex on the East River, the small cluster of people who had requested his presence, the sense that something was waiting to be built. He found a modest room in Queens, took a clerical job to cover basic expenses and began to hold quiet meditations for a handful of seekers who had heard about the new teacher from India. Before Sri Chinmoy ever entered Carlos's life, one person already stood at the crossroads of everything that was about to happen: John McLaughlin. To the outside world, McLaughlin was a force of nature, a guitarist whose speed, precision, and harmonic imagination could make other players feel like they were using blunt tools. But to Santana, he was something else entirely: a brother in the search for God inside sound. They first met in 1970, years before the ashram, when the musical world was splitting open in every direction. Santana came from a lineage of blues, rock, soul, and Latin fire. McLaughlin came from the British jazz underground, shaped by Miles Davis, Indian classical music, and a restless spiritual hunger that never fully left his eyes. Musicians talk about chemistry, but this was different. Carlos and John recognized each other instantly. Not as rivals, not as influences, but as two men carrying the same question. Is there something higher in music than technique, fame, or success? Is there a truth behind the notes? McLaughlin had already committed himself fully to Sri Chinmoy by the time Santana encountered that humming photograph. And when John spoke about the guru, it wasn't with the wide-eyed enthusiasm of a new disciple. It was calm, controlled, certain, like someone who believed he had finally found the axis around which his entire life could turn. For Santana, who admired McLaughlin not just as a musician, but as a kind of spiritual older brother, this mattered. John wasn't a lightweight. He wasn't a follower by nature. If he trusted this man, if he built his inner life around him, then maybe Santana could too. That bond between them, musical, spiritual, and deeply emotional, would shape everything that followed. It would draw Carlos toward the ashram. The path into Sri Chinmoy's orbit began, not with doctrine or a sermon, but with a photograph. Larry Coryell, a guitarist Santana respected deeply, carried a small image of a man seated in meditation. The posture was simple, the face composed. Santana later said the photo seemed to hum, as if there was a vibration trapped in the ink and paper. It is a striking description, one that reveals both his sensitivity and his readiness to perceive spiritual power wherever he looked. A single photograph cannot convert someone, but it can plant a seed. In this case, it suggested that spiritual depth might be accessible through a person, not just through private practice. Months later, the name came up again, this time carried by John McLaughlin. McLaughlin's reputation was towering. His work with Miles Davis, the ferocity of the Mahavishnu Orchestra, and his technical mastery commanded respect even from musicians who did not share his aesthetic. When a figure like that speaks about a guru with quiet conviction, the impact is significant. McLaughlin didn't present Sri Chinmoy as a casual interest. He spoke of him with the calm assurance of someone whose life had been rearranged by an encounter. The combination of Coryell's earlier introduction and McLaughlin's ongoing devotion created a pattern. Different, highly respected musicians pointing to the same source. The first in-person meeting took place at the Church Center for the United Nations. The setting was charged with symbolism, a spiritual gathering in a building associated with global diplomacy and moral aspiration. Santana and his partner Deborah arrived with flowers, a gesture of respect common in guru-disciple traditions. Sri Chinmoy appeared as a short, balding man in robes, not a towering or physically imposing figure. His power lay in presence and language, not in spectacle, at least in that room on that day. When introduced to Santana, he used phrases that many disciples would later recognize as part of a script. Good boy. I can see your soul wants to be here so bad. Such language operates on multiple levels. On the surface, it is a compliment and a welcome. Beneath that, it implies spiritual insight, an ability to read the inner life of the person standing in front of him. It suggests inevitability, that this meeting is not random, but the unfolding of something preordained. For someone who has been asking for direction, it sounds like an answer. To observers unfamiliar with such dynamics, these might appear as simple words. Within the framework of a seeker's psychology, they function as hooks. They create an immediate bond. They imply that the guru sees something in the disciple that others have missed, that he recognizes a depth that even the disciple may not have fully acknowledged. From Chinmoy's perspective, this encounter was also a significant acquisition. A world-famous musician was entering his orbit, one whose face and name could be associated with the movement. The interaction was brief, but its consequences would stretch nearly a decade. After that meeting, Santana did not simply walk away and forget. The sense of recognition lingered. The combination of the humming photograph, the testimonies of trusted musicians, and the experience of being addressed as someone whose soul wanted to be there created a momentum that would soon carry him to Queens, to a rented place near the ashram, and deeper into Sri Chinmoy's structured world of devotion. The transition from admirer to disciple is rarely marked by a single moment. It happens through a series of decisions that seem, at first, small. In Santana's case, those decisions led to a rented place on Parsons Boulevard in Queens, a short distance from Sri Chinmoy's ashram, and to a set of rules that reached into every corner of daily life. The expectations were clear. Hair had to be cut short. Clothing was to be simple, often white. Meat was forbidden. Alcohol, drugs, tobacco were strictly off-limits. Entertainment, television, movies, mainstream music, newspapers, magazines was to be avoided. The inflow of information was filtered until almost everything came from the guru or the community around him. Days began early. Reports from disciples described 5 a.m. meditation, often long, sometimes exhausting. There were collective gatherings, races, performances, events staged to demonstrate both spiritual commitment and physical endurance. The atmosphere combined ascetic discipline with a constant pressure to show enthusiasm and gratitude. For Santana and Deborah, entering this world meant reorienting their relationship as well. According to memoir accounts, Chinmoy told them to marry. It was presented not simply as a romantic milestone, but as part of their spiritual alignment. Marriages in such contexts are not just personal choices. They are assignments within a larger system, blessed and monitored by the leader. Celibacy, however, remained an expectation even for married couples. Sex was framed as lower vital, something that could pull disciples away from spiritual progress. Those who deviated risked shame, scolding, or being placed under emotional pressure to prove their devotion. The Queen's years divided Santana's life geographically and psychologically. Time was split between Marin County, where his previous life and many of his musical connections remained, and the orbit of the ashram in New York. The contrast was sharp. In one world, he was a star. In the other, he was a student. Within the ashram community, structures of authority reinforced Chinmoy's central position. There were senior disciples, coordinators, people who organized events and enforced norms, but all roads led back to the guru. Decisions about relationships, work, travel, and even minor personal matters could be subject to his guidance or approval. The language of surrender framed compliance as virtue and hesitation as spiritual failure. In such a context, ordinary discomforts and doubts are easily reinterpreted. Fatigue becomes a test. Confusion becomes an opportunity to surrender more deeply. Questioning becomes a sign that the ego is resisting transformation. This framework discourages critical thought without ever explicitly forbidding it. For a period, the structure worked for Santana. The early stages of total commitment often feel clarifying. Cutting off old habits, waking before dawn, following a strict schedule, these can produce a sense of focus, especially for someone who has lived through years of sensory overload on tour. But the structure also narrowed his world. Choices about music, about collaborators, about how to spend time, now existed within an invisible perimeter set by Chinmoy's approval. The change was gradual enough that it could feel like progress rather than confinement. By the time this routine was firmly in place, Carlos Santana was no longer just visiting a teacher. He was living inside a controlled environment that reshaped his identity, beliefs, and relationships. The best way to change how someone sees themselves is to give them a new name and imbue it with sacred meaning. For Santana, that name was Devadip, often translated as Lamp of God or Light of the Divine. Spiritual names serve several functions in high-commitment groups. They create a sense of special status marked by the leader's insight. They symbolically separate the disciple from their past. They signal to the community that this person belongs fully to the path. In public contexts, they also signal affiliation, turning a private commitment into a visible badge. Chinmoy did not keep Devadip confined to ashram gatherings. The name appeared on Santana's records, including albums whose artwork and liner notes carried the guru's language. Love, Devotion, Surrender, recorded with John McLaughlin, stands as a prime example. A devotional project dedicated to spiritual ideals. Its back cover featuring both guitarists kneeling before Chinmoy. Inside the movement, this alignment was presented as a triumph. A prominent musician had not only joined the path, but was using his art to spread its light. Outside, reactions were mixed. Some fans and critics respected the spiritual turn. Others saw it as a departure from the Santana they had connected with previously. Commercial performance fluctuated. None of this deterred the guru. Santana's own words from that era reveal the depth of his surrender. He spoke of Chinmoy as sitting in the seat of God, as someone who had completed many Harvards of consciousness. He described himself as an instrument. I am the strings, but he is the musician. In that framing, autonomy is not merely reduced, it is reframed as an obstacle to service. This was not a pose. By all accounts, Santana sincerely believed that aligning his life and music with the guru's teachings elevated his work. To him, discipline and surrender were paths toward clearer expression, toward channeling something beyond personal ambition. Yet the systems surrounding him reinforced dependence. The more he credited Chinmoy with his evolution, the more difficult it became to imagine walking away. When transformation is attributed to one person's guidance, doubt feels dangerous. Leaving feels like spiritual regression or even betrayal. Around him, other high-profile disciples reinforced the message. John McLaughlin, renamed Mahavishnu, embodied extreme devotion, structuring his musical and personal life around the path. Roberta Flack meditated with Chinmoy, ran races he organized, and drew inspiration for songs from that relationship. The pattern suggested that serious artists could, and perhaps should, anchor their lives in the guru's orbit. From the outside, it is easy to read manipulation into every interaction. From the inside, the experience was layered. Real moments of insight and calm intertwined with growing dependence and loss of autonomy. Devadip as a name captured both sides. It was a symbol of aspiration, of wanting to be a light. It was also a reminder that the source of that light in this framework was not within Santana himself, but in the man whose picture once seemed to hum. Life as Devadip unfolded in overlapping cycles of public performance and private ritual. Concerts, tours, and studio sessions alternated with ashram meetings, meditations, and events staged to showcase the guru's teachings. Chinmoy understood the value of visibility. Santana's presence drew attention to gatherings that might otherwise have remained obscure spiritual meetings. When a figure associated with Woodstock and global radio airplay walked onto a stage beside a spiritual leader, the images traveled far, lending weight to the guru's image. Within the community, Santana was held up as an example of how worldly success could be purified through surrender. The narrative was simple. Here was a man who had everything the material world offered and chose to place his talent at the feet of a master. That story reinforced recruitment. It suggested to aspiring musicians and seekers alike that no degree of achievement exempted one from needing a guide. Musically, the influence of the movement was unmistakable. Thematically, albums leaned into ideas of unity, surrender, oneness, and transcendence. Liner notes and artwork included Chinmoy's poems and aphorisms. Song titles and structures reflected meditative and devotional concepts. It is difficult to separate sincere spiritual exploration from the pressure, implicit or explicit, to keep aligning output with the guru's vision. Band dynamics shifted under this weight. Not every musician who worked with Santana shared his devotion to Chinmoy or wanted their creative work filtered through that lens. Some left quietly, others adapted. A core truth of collaborative art is that when one person's allegiance shifts so dramatically, everyone in the orbit feels the pull. Inside the ashram, Santana attended functions where Chinmoy delivered talks, staged feats of strength, or organized long-distance runs. The guru's interest in physical demonstrations, the alleged lifting of heavy objects, the obsession with ultramarathons, supported his image as someone who transcended normal limits. For disciples, these displays reinforced faith. For skeptics, they raised questions that were not safe to voice aloud in that setting. The expectations placed on Santana were not only musical. There were unspoken responsibilities. To represent the movement well in public, to speak positively about the guru when asked, to avoid behavior that might reflect badly on the path, Any conflict between his own instincts and the community's norms had to be resolved internally, often by framing his discomfort as ego or resistance. Yet life cannot be compressed indefinitely into a devotional mold. There were family relationships to navigate, personal histories that did not vanish simply because a spiritual name had been bestowed. The dual existence, Devadip in Queens, Carlos in the broader world, required constant adjustment. Over time, the rigidity of the system and the complexity of real life generated friction. To understand why Santana believed so deeply in Sri Chinmoy, you have to understand the role that music played in Chinmoy's mythology. To his disciples, Chinmoy wasn't just a spiritual master. He was a creative force, someone who claimed to compose thousands of songs, perform on over 100 instruments, and channel a divine flow that transcended technique. These performances were not about virtuosity. They were about symbolism. A flute played slowly and hesitantly became a metaphor for purity. A harmonium droned for 20 minutes became an invitation to inner stillness. A sitar plucked awkwardly became a reminder that spiritual sound did not need perfection, only sincerity. Santana, who was already exploring Eastern spiritual traditions through John Coltrane's writings, saw something resonant in this. Chinmoy's music was not technically impressive. Carlos knew that immediately. But it was devotional. It was stripped of ego. It aimed not at audiences, but at the divine. That distinction mattered. Inside the community, disciples weren't comparing Chinmoy to master musicians. They were comparing him to symbols. Every note he played was treated as a message, a gesture, a form of prayer. For Santana, whose identity was built on music, this was powerful. It linked his spiritual yearning to the one language he understood without thinking. And yet, there was also a shadow beneath the devotion. As the years went on, Chinmoy's musical claims became bigger, stranger, more public, including marathon performances on dozens of instruments in a single sitting. Supporters called them miracles. Critics called them theater. But for a long time, Santana didn't see contradiction. He saw possibility. He saw holiness wrapped in sound. Only later would he begin to separate the music he loved from the mythology that surrounded it. Every movement that presents a polished spiritual image to the outside world has an inner texture that does not make it into brochures and public talks. In Sri Chinmoy's case, former disciples and investigative reports have painted a picture of that internal reality, one that stands in stark contrast to the guru's claims of purity and self-control. Accounts from people like Jayanti Tom describe a childhood spent in an environment where the guru's presence saturated every space. Photographs of Chinmoy on every wall. Rules that governed everything from eye contact to entertainment. Alcohol, caffeine, smoking, drugs, television, radio, movies, mainstream music, newspapers, magazines, books not written by him, meat, dancing, and even pets, prohibited. The world beyond his words was framed as a distraction at best, a threat at worst. Followers were expected to remain single unless granted a divine marriage by the guru. Even then, celibacy was prescribed. Sexual activity between spouses could trigger scolding and guilt. In Tam's telling, when her parents conceived a child, Chinmoy reframed the act as both a failure and an opportunity to claim spiritual authorship over the new life. Years later, other ex-disciples reported experiences that went far beyond emotional pressure. Some described being summoned to private rooms, instructed to undress, told that surrender of their vital energy to the guru was demanded by the path. One woman recounted being asked to perform sexual acts with another disciple while he watched, then being told to forgive him when she challenged the behavior. Another detailed repeated encounters framed as sacred transmissions, followed by strict instructions never to speak of them. All of this stood against a public claim of lifelong celibacy and a teaching that condemned sexual activity as a drag on spiritual evolution. The dissonance between image and behavior is a familiar pattern in high-control groups centered on a charismatic leader. Chinmoy also engaged in elaborate public performances, lifting what were presented as elephants or planes or other heavy objects, with narratives attached that framed these as evidence of spiritual power rather than stagecraft. Disciples were encouraged to run long distances, sometimes extreme ones, as acts of devotion. Testimonies describe guilt-laden talks in which he compared followers to dead elephant weight he was forced to carry, adding layers of obligation and shame. For a disciple like Santana, Much of this hidden world may have been secondhand, half-seen, or felt rather than fully known. High-status followers can be shielded from some of the more disturbing practices, especially if their continued public presence is valuable to the movement. Yet even partial exposure creates unease. Stories leak in fragments. A conversation cut short when someone enters the room. A visible shift in another disciple's demeanor after a private meeting. Rules enforced unevenly, with exceptions that never get explained. A sense that some people are being used in ways that contradict the teachings. In such an environment, confronting contradictions directly is difficult. The psychological cost of admitting that a person revered as God realized might be manipulating and harming disciples is immense. For many, it is easier to rationalize, to call abuses tests, to blame victims for insufficient purity, to compartmentalize information and carry on. The allegations that later surfaced in media outlets detailing sexual coercion, secret relationships, and instructions to procure abortions did not come from outsiders. They came from people who had once believed as deeply as anyone. Their testimonies, alongside memoirs and investigative reports, reveal a movement in which surrender was not just spiritual metaphor, but a tool used to override boundaries. This is the world that coexisted with the public image of a serene guru surrounded by athletes, artists, and musicians. It is the backdrop against which Santana's remaining years in the movement, his doubts, and his eventual departure must be understood. By the mid-1970s, Sri Chinmoy had become more than a spiritual teacher. He had become a performer, staging spectacles that blurred the line between devotion and illusion. Newspapers covered events where he supposedly lifted cars, airplanes, and even elephants using divine strength. Photographs were taken. Followers cheered. Critics raised eyebrows. Inside the ashram, these feats were understood symbolically, demonstrations of inner power. Outside, they looked like stunts. Santana, who was now appearing publicly with Chinmoy and incorporating devotional imagery into his albums, was inevitably asked about these miracles. And his responses were consistent. That the physical details didn't matter, that the acts were metaphors, that the real miracle was consciousness itself. It was sincere, but it also revealed something deeper. The tightening loop of belief, where doubt was reframed as misunderstanding and spectacle was treated as spiritual metaphor. Meanwhile, former disciples were beginning to talk, quietly at first, then louder. Stories surfaced of coercion, celibacy rules, guilt, and control. Santana wasn't blind to the rumors. But inside the ashram, the narrative was different. Doubt was ego. Skepticism was spiritual weakness. And questioning the guru meant questioning one's own progress. For years, the spectacle held. For years, Santana remained committed. But outside pressure, combined with inner strain, would eventually tilt the balance. Doubt in a high-control spiritual environment rarely arrives as a sudden revelation. It tends to appear in small, persistent waves, a comment that doesn't sit right, a rule that feels arbitrary, a story that contradicts the official narrative. For Santana, the pressure points were layered. Professionally, he remained a working musician with obligations to labels, bandmates, and audiences. Creatively, he was drawn to sounds and collaborations that didn't always align neatly with the strict spiritual aesthetic encouraged by the movement. Personally, he had a marriage and family life that could not be fully dissolved into a devotional storyline. The expectations of the ashram, however, were totalizing. Time was to be structured around meditation, service, and guru-centered events. Emotional energy was to be directed toward the path. When disciplines compounded, diet, sleep, celibacy, informational isolation, the system left little room for honest exploration of conflicting needs. In such a context, natural impulses to rest, to resist, to question are easily reinterpreted as failures of devotion. A musician wanting to explore a different style might be told he is chasing ego. A spouse wanting more intimacy might be told she is attached to the lower vital. A disciple troubled by a rumor of inappropriate behavior might be told she is projecting her own impurity. Over time, this creates cognitive dissonance. On one side, there are genuine moments of peace in meditation, real experiences of community and shared purpose. On the other, there are widening cracks, inconsistency between the guru's teachings and his personal conduct, decisions that harm people framed as compassionate, expressions of anger or contempt delivered from a man who claims to have transcended such states. For a high-profile disciple, the dissonance is amplified by visibility. Any move away from the center will be noticed. Any sign of disillusionment carries the risk of being labeled as betrayal. That social and spiritual pressure can keep a person inside long after private conviction has begun to erode. In Santana's case, these pressures intersected with creative necessity. Music requires a degree of risk, experimentation, and honesty that is difficult to maintain under rigid ideological oversight. If every new idea must pass a spiritual litmus test set by someone who does not make music, the art flattens. What begins as a desire to purify expression can end as a narrowing of the artist's range. The psychological cost accumulates quietly. Fatigue deepens. Resentment flickers at the edges of consciousness. Loyalty remains, but it is no longer uncomplicated. A person may still feel love and gratitude for what they gained, while simultaneously recognizing the harm or restriction they are experiencing. Eventually, these internal realities become unsustainable. Something has to shift. The person must either suppress their doubts more completely or begin to step back. The next phase is rarely clean. It involves arguments, rationalizations, attempts to recommit, experiments with distance, and finally, the decision to leave. When Santana first entered the ashram, McLaughlin was already a pillar, a model disciple, a shining example of musical devotion, which is why his departure mattered. John didn't leave with public drama. He didn't denounce the movement. He simply stepped away, quietly, decisively, and with a sense of personal necessity. Inside the community, this created a fissure. If one of the guru's most disciplined, devoted students could walk away, what did that mean? For Santana, the impact was even deeper. McLaughlin wasn't just a friend. He was the spiritual compass that guided him into Chinmoy's world. And seeing that compass suddenly shift direction forced Carlos to confront something he had pushed aside for years. If John could leave, maybe the path wasn't as absolute as it seemed. Chinmoy, for his part, treated McLaughlin's departure the way he treated all departures, as a failure of the disciple, never of the teaching. But the dynamic inside the movement changed. Doubts became less imaginary, questions became less forbidden. And Santana, who had surrendered his name, his identity, and nearly a decade of his life, now watched the friend who led him in quietly walk out. When disciples leave a figure like Sri Chinmoy, the departure often does not look dramatic from the outside. There may be no public denunciation, no obvious break. The change is instead measured in attendance. Fewer visits to the ashram, more time away, unreturned calls, eventually a quiet absence. For someone as visible as Carlos Santana, the decision to leave in 1981 represented a turning point. It meant disentangling his identity from a name and image that had been woven into his public work. It meant reevaluating a decade of life choices, relationships, and beliefs. It meant facing the possibility that some of the authority he had attributed to the guru belonged, in fact, to his own intuition and effort. Groups often respond to departures with narratives designed to protect the leader's image. The person who leaves may be described as having fallen back into ego, succumbed to worldly temptation, or failed to withstand spiritual tests. These stories serve two functions. They discourage others from following, and they prevent remaining disciples from seriously considering the possibility that the person leaving may have valid reasons. The specifics of the conversations that surrounded Santana's departure are not fully documented. What is clear is that his time as Devadip ended, and the Santana who continued making music in the 1980s and beyond did so without Chinmoy's ongoing oversight. Leaving did not require abandoning spirituality. The same hunger that had driven him toward the guru continued to inform his life. He read new texts, drew from other systems, spoke of angels and visions, and maintained an eclectic spiritual vocabulary. The difference lay in where he located authority. Rather than placing one man between himself and the divine, he moved toward a more distributed model of guidance. Books, experiences, inner prompts. Yet departure does not erase influence. The disciplines he had practiced, the language he had internalized, the frameworks he had used to interpret experience, all of these remained. In this sense, leaving a movement is less like walking out of a building and more like stepping into another room of the same house. The architecture still shapes how the person moves. The courage required to leave is easy to underestimate. It involves accepting uncertainty where certainty once lived, taking responsibility for decisions once outsourced, and risking the loss of a community that, despite its problems, provided belonging and meaning. For Santana, the exit opened space. Musically, it allowed him to explore new collaborations and directions without needing them to fit into a prescribed spiritual narrative. Personally, it meant navigating relationships without an external arbiter. Spiritually, it invited the ongoing, messy, and less controlled process of listening for guidance without a single human intermediary. When Santana finally made the decision to leave Sri Chinmoy, the impact inside the movement rippled in every direction. To the guru, the departure was framed, as always, as a spiritual regression, a once promising disciple turning back toward the lower vital world, a disappointment. To some followers, Santana's exit felt like betrayal. He had been a symbol, a public embodiment of the movement's legitimacy. Seeing him go forced them to confront doubts they had buried. But to others, quietly, privately, his departure was a relief. Because if someone as devoted as Carlos could walk away, then maybe they weren't trapped. Maybe leaving wasn't spiritual failure. Maybe it was survival. Santana didn't leave in anger. He didn't wage a campaign against Chinmoy. He simply stepped out of the structure that had once given him purpose, discipline, and clarity, and now felt like a cage. And in doing so, he became something rare. A high-profile disciple who left without denouncing the teacher, but also without defending him. His exit was a question mark, and inside the ashram, question marks were dangerous. Long after a formal tie is cut, the echo of a relationship with a guru can reverberate through a life. For Carlos Santana, the years with Sri Chinmoy remain an unmistakable chapter, visible in album covers, interviews, and the trajectory of his spiritual language. He has continued to speak, at times with fondness and respect for what he learned during that era: discipline, focus, the idea of serving something beyond personal ambition. In other moments, he has made clear that he no longer lives under anyone's direct spiritual authority. Both truths can coexist: appreciation for specific tools gained and recognition that the system in which they were delivered was flawed, even harmful for some. The broader spiritual landscape he now inhabits is eclectic. References to angels, to Metatron, to texts like A Course in Miracles and other esoteric works show a willingness to draw from multiple streams. This approach differs sharply from the closed informational ecosystem of the ashram years. It suggests a move from singular dependence to a more plural, self-directed search. Yet, the pattern of seeking remains. The desire to connect music and mysticism, to treat sound as a carrier of healing or elevation, to see performances as more than entertainment, these threads run through his entire career. The time with Chinmoy amplified them, shaped them, and in some ways distorted them, but did not create them from scratch. If the ashram years strained Santana's identity, the years after brought something unexpected: renewal, forgiveness, and the rebuilding of a friendship that had survived the weight of a guru. Long after both men left Chinmoy, after the silence, after the distance, after the confusion, Santana and McLaughlin found each other again, not as disciples, not as seekers on parallel roads, but as musicians who had finally returned to themselves. Their reunion wasn't dramatic or performative. It was natural. Two artists reconnecting without the pressure of shared doctrine or spiritual hierarchy. They played together again. They recorded again. And the chemistry that had once drawn Santana toward Chinmoy returned, this time without strings attached. This matters because it reframes the whole story. What Santana found in Chinmoy, he also found, more authentically, in another musician. A brotherhood, a sense of elevation, a shared spiritual hunger. The guru was not the source of that connection. He was the interruption. And when both men stepped beyond the movement, their friendship became what it always should have been: two seekers walking side by side, not behind anyone else. The story of Santana and Sri Chinmoy is not easily reduced to a simple moral. It is not only a cautionary tale of exploitation, nor only a story of enlightenment through discipline. It occupies the complicated space where genuine spiritual experiences coexist with manipulation, where a person's earnest yearning can be both honored and exploited, where art is both enriched and constrained by belief. For observers, it raises questions that reach beyond one musician and one guru. Why are artists, in particular, drawn to figures who promise transcendence? How does the vulnerability that fuels creativity make someone more susceptible to control? What responsibility do spiritual leaders bear when they accept the devotion of people whose influence extends to millions? For Santana, the answers are personal, lived in private as much as in public. The guitars, the stages, the records carry traces of every phase he has passed through. The Devadip years remain there, a layer among many, not erased, not celebrated without qualification, simply part of the complex arc of a life spent chasing both sound and spirit. In telling this story, one thing is clear. The relationship between music and belief is not abstract. It shapes careers, bodies, marriages, communities. It can heal. It can harm. It can do both at once. The echo of that decade with Sri Chinmoy continues to resonate, not as a closed chapter, but as a frequency still audible beneath everything that came after. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to click like and subscribe for more strange stories about musicians and their involvement in cults.